Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to The English Globe, a space where global ideas meet English learning and where every serious conversation helps you improve your language skills while understanding how the world works. I'm Adam, and I'm truly glad you are spending your valuable time with us today. No matter if you are listening while relaxing at home, traveling, or studying, we appreciate you being part of this thoughtful and educational journey with us.
Yes, Adam, welcome everyone. Today's topic is very important and also very sensitive, so we will discuss it carefully, calmly, and in an educational way. In this episode, we are going to explore a major global question that has recently gained attention in international news. Trump threatens Iran over protests, power politics, or pressure tactics. This discussion is not about choosing sides, but about understanding language, global politics, and how international communication works.
That's exactly right, Julia. Statements made by United States leaders about Iran often attract global attention because the relationship between these two countries has a long and complicated history, shaped by political disagreements, economic sanctions, regional influence, and concerns about security, which means that even strong words spoken publicly can affect diplomacy, international markets, and global stability in ways that go far beyond simple headlines.
For our English learners, it's important to understand that when powerful countries speak about each other, the world listens carefully, not because words always lead to action, but because words themselves can send signals, apply pressure, or influence how other governments, organizations, and even ordinary people interpret future possibilities and risks.
To understand why this matters so much, we need some background. The United States and Iran have had tense relations for several decades, especially since formal diplomatic ties were reduced. And over time, this tension has included economic sanctions, political warnings, and disagreements about regional influence, which have made every public statement part of a larger international conversation, rather than just a personal opinion.
This is a great moment for learners to notice how English news often uses cause and effect language, because Adam is explaining that past political decisions created a situation where current statements automatically feel more serious, even when they are spoken without immediate action. And this pattern is very common in international reporting.
Another important point is why protests inside Iran become an international issue. Protests are, first of all, domestic events connected to internal social and political conditions, but when they happen in countries that already have tense relations with major global powers, they often attract external commentary, media coverage, and diplomatic responses, which can raise questions about sovereignty, meaning a country's right to manage its own internal affairs without outside interference.
In simpler terms, protests may begin inside one country, but the global media sometimes turns them into international stories, especially when powerful nations react publicly, and this is why learners should pay close attention to how words like domestic unrest, sovereignty, and international concern are used in serious English discussions.
Media framing also plays a crucial role here. Global news outlets often present political statements in ways that emphasize tension or urgency, because dramatic language attracts attention. But responsible analysis requires us to look beyond headlines and understand the broader context, including why a statement was made, who the audience was, and what strategic message it may be trying to communicate.
This is also an excellent opportunity for English learners to practice listening to long analytical explanations without rushing to judgment, because our goal is not to agree or disagree, but to understand vocabulary, sentence structure, and the way complex ideas are carefully expressed in formal spoken English.
Exactly, Julia. Throughout this episode, we will focus on education, clarity, and balance. We will explain key terms like sanctions, which are economic restrictions used as political tools, sovereignty, which refers to national independence, and pressure tactics, which describe non-military methods countries use to influence each other, all while keeping our discussion respectful and informative.
So, dear listeners, as we begin this discussion, we invite you to relax, listen carefully, and focus on understanding the language rather than forming quick opinions. This podcast is designed to help you build confidence with complex global topics while strengthening your English listening skills step by step.
Thank you for being here with us on the English Globe. In the next sections, we will explore the background, the language, and the global implications of political statements related to Iran and the United States, always keeping our focus on learning, understanding, and thoughtful analysis. Let's continue this journey together. When we begin to talk about Donald Trump as a leader on the global stage, it is important for our listeners to understand that he is not a former leader, but the current President of the United States, having begun his second term in January 2025, after winning the 2024 election and being inaugurated as the 47th president, which makes him one of the few political figures in recent history to serve non-consecutive terms in the highest office in America. And this fact alone means that his words and actions carry the weight of formal executive authority when communicated to countries around the world, to other leaders, and to global media audiences who report and interpret those statements through a variety of lenses.
For English learners, what Adam is explaining here is that President Trump holds real power right now, and when he speaks, his statements are considered official US policy until he changes them, and news agencies, world governments, and citizens in many countries pay attention to what he says because they know it represents the voice of one of the most powerful nations on Earth, which is why leaders like him must communicate carefully and why English learners need to pay attention to word choice, style, and tone when interpreting those messages in international news.
One key aspect of Donald Trump's approach to global leadership and foreign policy is the way he communicates. He often uses direct, clear, and assertive language to signal his intentions, which can contrast with more traditional diplomatic language that tends to be cautious, reserved, and designed to avoid escalation. Because in modern politics, leaders sometimes choose more public, straightforward messaging to make their positions immediately understandable to a broad global audience, rather than relying solely on private diplomatic channels or carefully scripted statements. In the case of recent remarks about Iran, for example, his direct wording has drawn immediate attention across international media outlets because of the very strong language used to warn Iran if certain conditions occur.
In simpler English for learners, Adam is making a distinction between diplomatic language, language that is gentle, neutral, and careful, and public political messaging, which can be loud and clear so that many different groups of people understand the intention right away. And this difference is exactly what students of English should practice recognizing when they read political news, because the same basic idea can be expressed in many different ways depending on the context, purpose, and audience.
Trump's preference for strong public statements can be seen not only in formal speeches given at international summits or press briefings, but also in the way he has used social media and public messaging platforms to communicate directly with a global audience, making his tone and wording part of the news cycle instantly, which in turn influences how governments, commentators, and ordinary citizens interpret his stance on issues like protests, security, and international pressure. Because when a political leader uses powerful phrases and vivid language, that communication style shapes the way people around the world perceive the situation and the possible implications of policy choices.
For learners, this is a great chance to notice specific tone words like assertive, which means speaking with confidence and strength, confrontational, which suggests a readiness to face disagreement directly, and strategic, which means that the speaker carefully chooses language to achieve a specific effect. And understanding these tone words helps learners not only decode the meaning of political statements, but also learn how tone changes the impact of English overall.
Another important point when studying Trump's communication style is that his choice of language does not operate in a vacuum. It interacts with the broader norms of international communication, where many governments prefer calm, measured language that avoids escalation, while some political leaders, including Trump, use bold messaging as a tactical tool meant to influence both foreign audiences and domestic supporters, because words can serve as a form of pressure tactic in international relations, indicating a leader's stance without immediately resorting to actions that are irreversible or legally binding under international law.
This explanation helps learners understand that calling language assertive or strong is not the same as saying it is dangerous or good. It simply means that the tone and intention behind the words are meant to convey firmness and clarity, and recognizing this distinction is part of advanced listening and reading comprehension in English, especially when the topic is global politics, where subtle differences in word choice make a big difference in meaning.
It is also useful for learners to recognize that diplomatic language often uses carefully structured phrases like, "We reaffirm our commitment," "We urge restraint," and "We seek constructive dialogue," whereas political messaging can include short, impactful phrases designed to grab attention, such as the recent warning President Trump posted that the United States was locked and loaded and ready to go if Iran responded violently to protests, a phrase that carries strong connotations because of its directness and urgency in public discourse, and this type of language is interpreted by global audiences as a signal of seriousness.
In clearer everyday English for learners, when political leaders use expressions that sound very intense or powerful, it doesn't necessarily mean action will follow immediately, but it does mean that the speaker wants to emphasize a point strongly and draw attention to it, so students should practice listening for signal words, the words and phrases that tell you how serious the speaker wants you to take the message, because that skill will help you follow international news more easily.
Finally, when we study leadership communication styles in a global context, we see that some leaders rely more on behind-the-scenes diplomacy, with careful words chosen to maintain long conversations, while others choose visible public messaging that purposely reaches a wide audience quickly. And Donald Trump's approach clearly leans toward public statements that are direct, bold, and structured to be easily understood by many listeners, both at home and around the world. Because this style is part of a larger strategy to ensure that his positions are noticed, debated, and responded to by governments, media, and citizens alike.
For you, dear learners, paying attention to these patterns between diplomatic versus political language and recognizing how tone changes meaning will deepen your English comprehension, especially in news and international topics. And if you practice identifying assertive versus cautious vocabulary in political statements, you will become more confident in following complex discussions without feeling overwhelmed by unfamiliar terminology or sentence structure.
When we talk about protests inside any country, including Iran, it is very important to approach the topic with balance and neutrality, because protests are not unique to one nation or one political system, but are a global phenomenon that has appeared throughout history in democratic countries, developing nations, and advanced economies alike, usually emerging when groups of people feel that their voices are not being heard, their economic conditions are difficult, or social expectations are changing faster than existing systems can respond, which means protests should first be understood as a form of public expression rather than immediately judged as right or wrong.
For English learners, this is a good moment to notice neutral vocabulary such as public dissent, demonstrations, and civil unrest, because these terms are commonly used in serious news reporting to describe protests without emotional language, and learning to recognize these words helps listeners understand reports clearly without being influenced by strong opinions or dramatic expressions.
In many countries around the world, protests arise due to a combination of economic pressures, political disagreements, social inequality, or cultural changes, and while the specific causes may differ from place to place, the underlying pattern is often similar, as citizens use protests as a way to communicate dissatisfaction or demand reform when they feel other channels of communication are limited or ineffective. which makes protests an internal issue connected closely to a country's own history, laws, and social structure.
In simple English, Adam is explaining that protests usually begin inside a country because of local reasons, not because of outside influence. And this is why journalists and English learners should be careful to separate internal causes from external reactions, since mixing these two ideas can lead to misunderstanding both the situation itself and the language used to describe it.
When protests occur inside Iran, they are primarily a domestic matter related to internal governance, economic conditions, and social expectations, and from the perspective of international norms, this connects directly to the concept of national sovereignty, which means that each country has the right to manage its own internal affairs without interference from other states, even though those events may still attract international attention due to Iran's role in regional and global politics.
This is where neutral reporting language becomes very important for learners to understand, because phrases like internal matter, domestic situation, or national sovereignty are used to show respect for a country's independence. And when you hear these expressions in English news, they often signal an attempt to describe events carefully rather than to judge or provoke.
At the same time, it is also true that in today's interconnected world, internal protests can lead to external reactions, especially when countries have existing tensions or strong political relationships, and these reactions may come in the form of official statements, diplomatic comments, or media analysis, which do not necessarily change the internal nature of the protests, but do influence how the global audience understands and discusses the situation.
For learners, it is helpful to notice how English news often separates facts from reactions, using structures like according to officials, international observers stated, or foreign governments expressed concern, because these phrases show that the speaker is reporting responses rather than adding personal opinion, which is a key skill in advanced English listening and reading.
Media responsibility plays a major role in how protests are perceived globally, because journalists and broadcasters choose which words, images, and headlines to use, and responsible reporting aims to inform audiences accurately without exaggeration, fear-based language, or political pressure, especially when covering sensitive events that involve people's safety, national stability, and international relations.
This is why neutral vocabulary matters so much, as words like protesters gathered, demonstrations continued, or authorities responded are examples of descriptive language that focus on what happened rather than how the reader should feel. And English learners should practice identifying these patterns to avoid confusion when following complex global stories.
Another important point is that protests should not automatically be interpreted as signs of collapse or crisis, because in many societies they are part of ongoing political dialogue and social change, and while their scale and impact can vary greatly, understanding them requires patience, context, and respect for the people involved, rather than quick conclusions based on limited information or emotionally charged headlines.
For learners, this reinforces an important lesson about English used in international topics, which is that serious discussions often rely on calm tone, balanced sentence structure, and carefully chosen verbs like expressed, indicated, or responded, instead of dramatic verbs that suggest conflict or danger. And recognizing this difference helps build confidence when listening to long educational podcasts like this one.
In the context of Iran, international attention to protests is often influenced by the country's strategic position, past relations with major powers, and ongoing diplomatic discussions, but it remains essential to distinguish between internal dynamics and external commentary, because mixing these perspectives can oversimplify a very complex reality that deserves thoughtful and respectful analysis.
In clear and simple terms, this means that while the world may watch and talk about protests, the events themselves belong first to the society where they are happening, and English learners should focus on understanding how neutral language allows journalists and analysts to discuss sensitive topics without taking sides or encouraging conflict.
As we continue this podcast, our goal is not to judge or predict outcomes, but to help you understand how global issues are discussed in careful, neutral English, and by learning how protests are described respectfully and accurately, you strengthen both your language skills and your ability to follow serious international conversations with clarity and confidence.
So, dear listeners, remember that learning English through real-world topics like this helps you grow not only as a language learner, but also as an informed global listener. And by focusing on neutral descriptive language, you can understand complex situations calmly, thoughtfully, and without unnecessary emotional pressure.
When we examine what President Donald Trump actually said regarding Iran, it is essential to slow down and focus carefully on the language itself rather than reacting emotionally or jumping to conclusions, because in international politics, words are often chosen deliberately to signal intention, strength, or caution, and a single sentence can function not as a promise of action, but as a calculated message designed to influence behavior, shape media discussion, and communicate a position to multiple audiences at the same time, including foreign governments, domestic supporters, international institutions, and global observers who understand that wording often matters as much as action.
For English learners, this means we should not only ask what was said, but how it was said, because political English often uses indirect meaning, strong tone, or symbolic phrases that sound simple but carry deeper messages, and learning to recognize this difference helps listeners avoid misunderstanding news reports, especially when journalists repeat powerful sentences without always explaining the intention behind them.
Political warnings are usually worded in a way that leaves space for interpretation, because leaders often want to appear firm without legally or diplomatically committing themselves to a specific action, which is why statements may include conditional language, strong verbs, or vivid expressions that suggest readiness or seriousness, while still stopping short of clear promises. And this balance allows leaders to apply pressure, influence decisions, and signal limits without crossing into direct confrontation.
In simple English, Adam is saying that a political warning is often designed to sound serious but flexible, and learners should notice phrases that imply conditions, such as, if this continues, or there will be consequences, because these expressions do not always describe immediate action, but instead suggest possible outcomes depending on what happens next.
This brings us to an important distinction between a threat, a warning, and a pressure signal, because while these words are often used interchangeably in everyday conversation, they have different meanings in international communication, where a threat usually suggests a clear intention to act, a warning highlights potential risks without direct commitment, and a pressure signal uses strong language mainly to influence behavior rather than announce a specific response.
For learners, understanding this difference is very important, because news headlines may use dramatic words like threatens to attract attention, while the actual statement may be closer to a warning or a pressure message, so it is useful to listen for verbs, conditions, and tone instead of relying only on headline language.
In President Trump's case, his statements often use direct and powerful wording that attracts attention quickly. But from a linguistic perspective, many of these statements are structured to emphasize seriousness rather than to describe a clear sequence of actions, which is why analysts focus closely on exact phrases, sentence structure, and repetition when interpreting what the statement is truly communicating on a diplomatic level.
This is where indirect meaning becomes important in English, because a speaker may not say, "We will act immediately," but instead use expressions that suggest preparedness or resolve. And learners should practice identifying these indirect signals by listening carefully to tone, intensity, and context, rather than expecting very clear or literal explanations.
Media interpretation plays a powerful role in shaping how such statements are understood globally, because journalists often summarize long political comments into short headlines or clips, which can change emphasis or remove nuance. And while this is part of modern news communication, it also means that listeners should be aware that the original wording may be more complex and carefully balanced than the simplified version presented in breaking news.
For English learners, this is an important lesson in critical listening, because understanding political English requires patience and attention to detail, especially when media outlets choose words that sound stronger or more dramatic than the original statement. And recognizing this difference helps learners build confidence when following serious global discussions.
Exact wording matters greatly in international politics because diplomatic language operates within legal, historical, and strategic frameworks, where a small change in phrasing can affect how other governments respond, how markets react, and how public opinion forms, which is why leaders and their advisors often spend significant time crafting statements that balance strength, caution, and ambiguity.
In everyday English terms, this means that political language is often written and spoken very carefully, even when it sounds simple, and learners should remember that short sentences can still carry heavy meaning, especially when spoken by powerful leaders whose words are expected to signal direction rather than emotion.
When we analyze statements like these linguistically, we are not trying to predict outcomes or judge intentions, but rather to understand how language functions as a tool of influence. Because in global politics, words can calm situations, raise pressure, or signal boundaries without any immediate action, making language itself a form of power that deserves careful and thoughtful listening.
For our listeners, this section is about learning how to separate emotion from meaning and how to recognize implied messages in English, so that when you hear strong political statements in the future, you can understand not only the surface words, but also the deeper intention behind them, which is an essential skill for advanced English learners.
As we move forward, keep in mind that understanding diplomatic English is not about agreeing or disagreeing, but about recognizing how leaders communicate strategically, and by focusing on wording, tone, and structure, you strengthen your ability to follow international news with clarity, balance, and confidence.
Exactly. And the more you practice listening to this kind of careful analysis, the more comfortable you will become with complex English sentences, indirect meaning, and formal political language, which will support your progress as a thoughtful English learner engaging with real-world topics.
When we talk about power politics, we are describing a concept in international relations where countries focus primarily on maintaining influence, protecting national interests, and shaping outcomes in their favor, rather than relying only on shared values or moral principles. And this way of thinking helps learners understand why strong nations often act carefully and strategically, using economic strength, diplomatic pressure, and public messaging to guide events, because power politics is less about sudden action and more about long-term positioning within a global system where influence itself becomes a tool.
In simple everyday English, power politics means that powerful countries try to use what they already have, like money, trade power, alliances, or global reputation, to influence other countries, instead of using force. And learners should notice connectors such as rather than, instead of, and because, which help explain choices and comparisons clearly, making abstract political ideas easier to understand and follow in long listening exercises.
One important thing to understand is that power politics does not automatically mean conflict or hostility, because many examples of power politics happen quietly through negotiations, economic decisions, or public statements that send signals to other governments. And these signals often aim to influence behavior by shaping expectations, encouraging caution, or setting boundaries, which allows countries to protect their interests without creating instability or escalating situations unnecessarily.
For English learners, this explanation shows how neutral language can describe sensitive topics calmly, and words like influence, signals, and boundaries are often used in news reports to avoid emotional tone. So when you hear these terms, you should understand that the speaker is explaining strategy, not supporting or criticizing any specific country or action.
A useful comparison is to think about power politics like a game of chess rather than a physical fight, because in chess, players rarely rush into risky moves, but instead plan several steps ahead, using positioning and pressure to limit the opponent's options, and in global politics, strong countries often behave in a similar way by shaping rules, alliances, and economic conditions so that outcomes develop in their favor over time.
This analogy helps learners understand complex ideas more easily and notice how connectors like rather than instead, and so that are used to show contrast and purpose, which are very common in advanced English explanations and help listeners follow long and detailed arguments without feeling lost.
Strong countries often choose influence instead of direct action because action can be costly, unpredictable, and difficult to reverse, while influence allows flexibility and adjustment, meaning that leaders can respond to changes, read reactions, and modify their approach if necessary, which is especially important in a world where political decisions affect global markets, diplomatic relationships, and public opinion almost instantly.
In clearer English, this means that words, policies, and signals are often safer tools than actions, and learners should pay attention to abstract vocabulary like flexibility, adjustment, and leverage, because these words frequently appear in discussions about global strategy and help describe why leaders prefer pressure and persuasion over direct moves.
Economic influence is one of the most common tools in power politics, because trade access, investment, and financial systems allow strong countries to encourage cooperation or express dissatisfaction without using force, and by adjusting economic relationships, governments can communicate seriousness while still leaving room for dialogue, compromise, and future cooperation, which makes economic tools central to modern international strategy.
For learners, this shows how political English often sounds calm even when the situation is serious, and sentence connectors like as a result for this reason, and which means help link causes and outcomes clearly, making long explanations easier to understand during extended listening practice.
Public statements and political language are also important parts of power politics, because when leaders speak publicly, they are not only communicating with other governments, but also with global audiences, markets, and institutions, and these statements can reinforce influence by shaping expectations and signaling limits, all without taking irreversible steps that could close the door to future negotiation.
In everyday language, this means that what leaders say is often just as important as what they do, and for English learners, recognizing this helps build confidence when listening to political podcasts. Because understanding tone, connectors, and abstract vocabulary allows you to follow serious global topics calmly, logically, and without emotional pressure.
In international relations, the concept of pressure tactics refers to the deliberate use of influence, leverage, or strategic messaging to guide the behavior of other countries without immediately resorting to military action, which makes it an important tool for governments that aim to achieve objectives while avoiding direct confrontation. Pressure can take many forms, including economic measures, diplomatic actions, and public statements, and understanding how these methods work helps learners see that global politics is often less about immediate conflict and more about calculated strategies designed to influence decisions over time. For example, when a country adjusts trade access, restricts financial flows, or applies targeted sanctions, it sends a clear signal to other nations about expectations, red lines, or consequences without initiating physical action, which is why careful wording and consistency are essential for these measures to be effective, because ambiguity can lead to misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or unintended escalation in complex international systems.
In simpler English, Adam is explaining that pressure tactics are like using rules, signals, and restrictions to make countries follow certain expectations without fighting. For learners, noticing phrases like, without immediately resorting, deliberate use, and designed to influence is useful, because these are formal ways of expressing cause, purpose, and intention in English, and when sentences are longer and connected with words like including, which makes, or because, it creates a rhythm that is common in news, academic, and political English, helping listeners follow the flow of complex ideas naturally.
Economic pressure is one of the most frequently used tactics in international relations because trade, investment, and access to global markets are critical levers of influence. By restricting imports, adjusting tariffs, or limiting financial transactions, a country can signal dissatisfaction, encourage compliance, or incentivize changes in behavior without using military force, which makes these tools both powerful and flexible. Economic measures are often combined with formal diplomatic channels so that the target country understands the underlying purpose of these actions, while also providing room for negotiation and discussion. Because the ultimate goal of pressure tactics is not to destroy relationships, but to adjust behavior in a controlled, predictable manner, demonstrating that careful planning and messaging are as important as the measures themselves in achieving desired outcomes.
For learners, this means that economic words like tariff, investment, transactions, and incentivize appear frequently in international news, and noticing how Adam links ideas with connectors like while also, because, and both, and helps you understand long sentences that describe cause and effect. Formal sentence rhythm, where multiple clauses are combined logically, is a key feature of diplomatic English and helps learners follow the complex explanation step by step without losing the main idea.
Diplomatic pressure is another widely used tactic in international relations, often involving formal meetings, official statements, multilateral negotiations, and sometimes private communications that are later summarized for public awareness. Governments can apply diplomatic pressure by making public declarations about expected behavior, emphasizing adherence to international agreements, or expressing concern in multilateral forums, which allows countries to influence decisions while maintaining formal respect for sovereignty. Such actions are carefully coordinated to ensure clarity of message and consistency with broader foreign policy goals, because inconsistent or contradictory statements can weaken credibility and reduce the effectiveness of the pressure, highlighting that even non-coercive measures require strategic planning, timing, and attention to tone, formality, and phrasing.
In simpler terms, this means that diplomats use carefully chosen words, meetings, and statements to make other countries understand what is expected. And formal English often uses longer sentences with multiple ideas, where connectors like while, because, which allows, and highlighting that are used to link thoughts logically. Learners should listen for these connectors because they help organize information in long educational discussions, and they are very common in English used in news, international organizations, and academic settings.
Public messaging is another form of pressure that is especially relevant in today's connected world, where statements, speeches, social media posts, and press releases are all part of the toolkit countries use to shape international perception. Leaders can communicate seriousness, resolve, or strategic intent without committing to immediate action, because the statement itself acts as a signal that may influence both domestic and international audiences. For example, when a country makes a public statement regarding protests, policy decisions, or regional security, it often aims to reassure allies, alert competitors, and demonstrate leadership in a non-violent way, which makes the choice of words, tone, and placement crucial, because public messaging carries both symbolic and practical consequences in shaping global discussions.
For learners, notice the difference between formal and informal political English. Words like resolve, strategic intent, symbolic, and practical consequences are examples of formal vocabulary commonly used in international affairs, whereas informal English might simplify these ideas to showing seriousness or sending a message. paying attention to how sentences are structured, where clauses are connected by words like because, which makes, and, for example, helps learners understand and produce formal English for academic or professional purposes.
It is also important to remember that pressure tactics are not inherently positive or negative. They are simply tools used to achieve policy objectives without direct confrontation. Their effectiveness depends on timing, clarity, credibility, and consistency, because poorly communicated measures or unclear signals can create confusion, misinterpretation, or unintended escalation. By studying how countries apply pressure carefully, learners can understand that international relations are rarely about immediate action, but rather about calculated influence, where language, diplomacy, and strategy are tightly linked, and where every word and gesture can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate situation.
In everyday English, this means that leaders use words, signals, and actions as tools to guide other countries' behavior, and learners should focus on sentence structure and word choice, because noticing formal patterns and linking phrases in long explanations helps you follow complex ideas. Words like credibility, consistency, and timing are abstract but essential, and recognizing them in long sentences strengthens both listening and comprehension skills in formal contexts.
Finally, understanding pressure tactics as a concept emphasizes the role of education, analysis, and careful listening in global affairs. By examining economic, diplomatic, and public messaging tools, learners can see that international politics is often strategic, measured, and deliberate, and that strong countries may prefer influence over force to achieve their objectives, because effective pressure combines clarity, planning, and appropriate tone, demonstrating that language itself is a form of power in the hands of leaders who understand the delicate balance of global diplomacy.
For learners, this section provides an opportunity to practice long sentences, understand formal English rhythm, and recognize abstract vocabulary in context. By listening carefully to how Adam connects multiple ideas with clauses and connectors, learners can improve comprehension, gain confidence in following serious global topics, and become more aware of how formal English is used to describe sensitive international phenomena without bias, speculation, or emotional judgment.
When we study media framing and public perception, it is essential to understand that the way news is presented significantly influences how audiences interpret events, because headlines, images, and selective emphasis can create impressions that differ from the full context or original statements, which is why serious learners of English should develop the ability to compare headlines with detailed reporting. For example, a headline may use dramatic words like threatens or warns, while the full article provides careful quotes, context, and nuances that clarify the meaning. This distinction is crucial because the media does not simply report facts. It frames information in ways that attract attention, prioritize certain details, or create a particular narrative. And by noticing these patterns, listeners and readers improve their analytical skills and gain a more accurate understanding of events like international tensions or protests.
For English learners, Adam is explaining that you should look beyond dramatic headlines to understand what really happened. And useful verbs like reported, stated, explained, and noted often appear in neutral news reporting. These verbs signal that the speaker is conveying information without inserting opinion. And by noticing them, learners can separate facts from interpretation, which is very important when following long, complex topics in international news. Connectors like while, although, and which means also help connect ideas and create smooth professional sentence flow that is very common in formal English.
Media responsibility plays a central role in shaping public perception because journalists, editors, and broadcasters decide what to include, how to phrase statements, and which images to use, and these decisions can influence how the audience interprets political statements, protests, or international developments. Responsible reporting requires accuracy, neutrality, and clarity, especially when covering sensitive events, because misrepresentation can lead to misunderstandings, exaggeration, or public anxiety, while careful framing ensures that audiences understand both the facts and the context. This is why media literacy is important for learners. By understanding the difference between emotionally charged reporting and factual reporting, you can follow global developments without confusion or bias.
In simpler terms, Adam is saying that journalists choose words, pictures, and what to highlight, and these choices affect what you think about a story. Learners should pay attention to words like claimed, emphasized, confirmed, and observed, which are commonly used in news to show neutrality, and noticing sentence patterns like, although the statement was strong, the official clarified, or while some interpreted this as a threat. The spokesperson explained helps learners follow complex reports clearly and calmly.
Headlines, in particular, are designed to attract attention, and they often use emotional or simplified language to capture readers immediately, while the full article typically provides detailed explanations, quotes, and context. Understanding this difference is essential for learners because reading only headlines can create misconceptions, exaggerate dangers, or oversimplify nuanced situations. For instance, a headline may read, "Trump threatens Iran over protests," which sounds dramatic, while the article might clarify that the statement was a conditional warning meant to signal seriousness without specifying action. By comparing headlines with full text, learners develop critical reading skills and learn to approach information thoughtfully.
For learners, this is an excellent moment to practice noticing tone and intent. Words like alleged, asserted, warned, and indicated are key in reporting because they allow journalists to describe statements accurately without endorsing them. And by identifying these verbs in longer sentences, learners can understand subtle meaning and practice reading with comprehension, especially in formal English used for serious international topics.
Emotional language, including words that suggest fear, anger, or immediate danger, can appear in both print and digital media, and it is important to distinguish this from neutral reporting, which focuses on facts, context, and cause and effect relationships. By recognizing the difference, learners can train themselves to listen and read critically, understanding that emotionally charged language may be intended to attract attention or evoke response rather than provide balanced information. For instance, sensational phrasing may amplify tension, while neutral phrasing provides clarity, exact quotes, and context to ensure that the audience grasps the real situation without unnecessary alarm.
In everyday English, Adam is teaching that dramatic words in media are not always the same as the actual events, and learners should notice sentence structures like, although the headline emphasized X, the report clarified Y, or the official statement indicated that, which help connect ideas logically. Learning these structures improves comprehension, helps follow long discussions, and teaches learners to analyze media critically rather than reacting emotionally to initial impressions.
Critical thinking is therefore an essential skill for English learners, because international news often involves complex interactions, statements, and responses. By practicing comparison, analysis, and careful listening, learners can recognize how reporting choices influence understanding. This is particularly important in topics like political warnings, protests, or economic sanctions, where subtle differences in phrasing or emphasis can shape public perception significantly. The goal is to learn to separate fact from framing, which allows learners to follow events in a balanced, informed, and calm manner, improving both language comprehension and awareness of global dynamics.
For English learners, this means developing the habit of reading carefully, noticing neutral reporting verbs, and recognizing connectors that organize complex information. Words like clarified, explained, noted, and emphasized, as well as phrases like in response to, according to, or, while some interpreted this, provide tools to follow reasoning in long sentences, making it easier to understand news in context and prepare for more advanced listening or reading comprehension tasks.
Finally, media framing shapes not only understanding, but also public discussion, because audiences often repeat, summarize, or share stories based on their initial perception. Therefore, learners who pay attention to both headlines and full explanations, distinguish emotional versus neutral language, and note reporting verbs and connectors gain valuable skills for analyzing information critically. By practicing these strategies, you strengthen listening, reading, and analytical skills simultaneously, and you become better equipped to navigate complex topics such as international relations, protests, or diplomatic statements, understanding them accurately without overreacting or misunderstanding context.
In summary, critical reading and listening skills allow learners to identify bias, differentiate emotional from factual reporting, and recognize the role of framing in shaping public perception. Paying attention to sentence rhythm, connectors, reporting verbs, and tone prepares learners to engage with international news confidently and thoughtfully, improving both language proficiency and global awareness, and helping learners build the habit of approaching media with a careful, analytical perspective rather than reacting to the first impression or dramatic headline.
When discussing international law and sovereignty, it is crucial to understand that every country has the legal right to govern its own territory, manage its internal affairs, and make decisions for its population without external interference, and this principle, known as sovereignty, forms the foundation of international relations and is recognized in treaties, conventions, and customary law around the world. Sovereignty ensures that countries can establish laws, enforce policies, and address domestic challenges according to their own priorities, while also interacting with other nations under agreed-upon rules, which creates a balance between national independence and global cooperation. And learners should note that this principle explains why countries often respond strongly to statements or actions from foreign leaders that may be perceived as overstepping boundaries, because even carefully worded messages can touch on sensitive legal and political issues.
In simpler English for learners, sovereignty means that each country has the right to make its own decisions without anyone else telling it what to do. This is why countries can react strongly when leaders from other nations speak publicly about their internal affairs. Notice useful words like interference, recognized, and treaties, which often appear in formal discussions about law and international relations. By practicing pronunciation of these words and following the rhythm of long sentences connected with while, which, and because, learners can improve both listening comprehension and academic English skills, especially in contexts related to law or global affairs.
Countries react strongly to external statements about domestic issues because such statements may be perceived as challenges to their sovereignty or attempts to influence internal decision-making. In international relations, even verbal communication can have legal and political consequences because governments are expected to protect their authority, maintain domestic stability, and ensure that foreign interventions, whether direct or indirect, do not undermine national law or constitutional processes. Therefore, leaders often respond with careful diplomacy, legal references, or official statements emphasizing respect for sovereignty, highlighting that international law governs not only actions, but also the manner and tone of public communication between states.
Put simply, this means that when another country makes a strong public statement about domestic events, it can be seen as stepping over the line, so governments respond carefully to protect their independence. Learners should notice phrases like perceived as, attempts to influence, and emphasizing that, which are formal constructions used in news, diplomacy, and academic English. Long sentences connected with words like because, which, and therefore help learners follow complex reasoning without losing the main point, building both comprehension and formal writing skills.
International organizations, such as the United Nations, play a critical role in reinforcing sovereignty and providing mechanisms for dispute resolution. These institutions establish guidelines, conventions, and frameworks that member states agree to follow, ensuring that international interactions occur within legally recognized boundaries which prevents unilateral actions from escalating into conflicts. Organizations can issue statements, mediate negotiations, and provide forums for discussion, all of which help countries communicate concerns, clarify intentions, and maintain peace, demonstrating that sovereignty does not mean isolation, but rather responsible engagement with the global community under agreed-upon legal norms.
For learners, this means that while countries are independent, they also cooperate through international organizations to resolve conflicts and maintain rules. Words like frameworks, mediate, forums, and norms are formal vocabulary used in legal and political contexts. Listening to long connected sentences with multiple clauses helps learners get used to academic English because it shows how ideas about law, responsibility, and cooperation are linked logically for clarity and precision.
It is also important to recognize that sovereignty is not absolute, because countries voluntarily enter agreements that create obligations under international law, such as treaties on trade, human rights, or environmental protection. These agreements balance national autonomy with collective responsibility, which means that while countries have the right to govern internally, they also agree to rules that influence behavior in the global system. Learners should understand that international law is complex, combining both hard rules and customary practices, and that legal limits often define what leaders can say or do publicly when discussing the affairs of other states, because respecting these limits prevents disputes from escalating and maintains legitimacy in the eyes of the international community.
In easier English, Adam is explaining that countries are independent, but they also make agreements that affect how they act. Words like obligations, autonomy, and legitimacy are advanced academic vocabulary that learners should practice, and using connectors like which means that, because, and while helps structure long sentences clearly. This improves both listening comprehension and the ability to read formal English about law, diplomacy, and governance.
Statements by foreign leaders, even if intended as warnings or commentary, can therefore have legal and diplomatic implications. International law emphasizes that countries should avoid interfering in domestic matters, and leaders must carefully choose their words to maintain credibility, avoid misinterpretation, and respect the sovereignty of other nations. Miscommunication can result in tensions, official protests, or formal diplomatic responses, and understanding this framework allows learners to see that global interactions are governed not only by power, but also by rules, precedent, and careful communication, where even verbal messages can act as instruments of influence or points of contention in international relations.
For learners, this shows why paying attention to sentence structure and reporting verbs is important. Words like emphasizes, maintain credibility, avoid misinterpretation, and formal diplomatic responses often appear in news and academic discussions, and noticing connectors like and, where, and even if helps learners follow long explanations. Practicing pronunciation and rhythm of long sentences in formal English improves comprehension and builds confidence in understanding complex legal and political topics.
Finally, understanding sovereignty and international law in this context provides learners with a framework to interpret international news and statements more accurately. By knowing that countries have rights, legal responsibilities, and frameworks guiding their interactions, listeners can analyze events without jumping to conclusions, recognizing that words and actions operate within carefully defined limits. This understanding not only enhances comprehension of political reporting, but also strengthens English skills by introducing formal vocabulary, academic sentence structures, and logical connectors used to explain cause, effect, and obligation in global affairs.
In conclusion, learners should practice recognizing formal vocabulary, long sentences, and logical connectors when following discussions about sovereignty and law. Words like frameworks, responsibility, precedent, and implications, along with connectors like because, therefore, and which means that, are essential in academic English. Listening carefully to these patterns helps learners understand complex international topics clearly, build critical thinking skills, and gain confidence in both reading and listening to professional formal English used in global affairs and diplomacy.
In international relations, when a statement from a powerful leader is made regarding another country, global reactions are often carefully measured and expressed in neutral or formal language, because countries aim to protect their interests, maintain stability, and preserve diplomatic relations without escalating tension. Reactions typically take the form of official statements, press releases, or diplomatic notes that emphasize dialogue, cooperation, and restraint. And by studying these responses, learners can understand how nations communicate concerns while adhering to international norms. Words like express concern, call for restraint, and encourage dialogue are central in this context because they convey serious attention to an issue without implying hostility or provoking conflict. And these phrases are carefully chosen to signal both awareness and willingness to resolve matters peacefully, which is a critical aspect of modern diplomacy.
For English learners, Adam is explaining that countries often speak very politely when they respond to sensitive international events, using phrases that show respect while stating their position. Expressions like urge restraint, express concern, encourage dialogue, and call for stability are common in official communications, and noticing these verbs and connectors in long sentences helps learners understand the tone of formal political English. Using connectors like because, while, and which helps allows listeners to follow complex arguments and connect ideas logically, building comprehension in extended listening situations.
Countries around the world also take care to avoid strong or aggressive language in official statements, because international relations rely on careful signaling to prevent misunderstandings or unintended escalation. For example, when addressing political unrest or protests, a government might state that it urges all parties to exercise restraint, or emphasizes the importance of dialogue, which communicates concern and attention without making judgments or threatening actions. Such statements demonstrate that diplomacy often prioritizes stability, negotiation, and careful communication over immediate reaction, and learners can see that formal sentence structures in these statements are designed to balance clarity, neutrality, and subtle persuasion in international communication.
In simpler English, this means that countries try to speak calmly and politely, even about serious matters. Words like urges, emphasizes, and encourages are formal verbs used in polite political English, and learners should pay attention to how clauses are linked, for example, because while or in order to, which helps organize longer sentences. Understanding these patterns allows learners to follow statements made by governments, international organizations, or diplomats, and helps them practice recognizing polite, indirect, and careful language in English, which is widely used in both news reporting and official communications.
Global reactions also often highlight the importance of multilateral institutions, such as the United Nations, regional organizations, and diplomatic networks, because these platforms provide channels for discussion, conflict prevention, and coordination among countries. Through official statements, joint declarations, or coordinated communications, countries can demonstrate shared concern, reinforce international norms, and encourage peaceful resolution of tensions. For learners, observing how these statements are structured provides insight into advanced sentence construction, logical connectors, and the ways formal English is used to communicate policy positions without resorting to confrontational language.
In everyday terms, this means that countries work together through organizations to keep discussions peaceful and organized. Phrases like joint statement, shared concern, reinforce norms, and encourage resolution appear frequently in professional English, and learners can improve understanding by listening carefully to how multiple clauses are combined in long sentences. Connectors like because, which allows and while also help link ideas logically, making complex diplomatic English easier to follow.
Another important aspect is that responses are usually tailored to communicate both to domestic and international audiences. By carefully crafting statements, governments signal their seriousness to the global community while reassuring their own citizens that diplomatic processes are being followed. For example, emphasizing the need for dialogue or calling for calm and restraint shows that the government is attentive to international norms and committed to peaceful engagement. For learners, this is an opportunity to observe formal politeness strategies in English, such as indirect phrasing, modal verbs like should or may, and expressions that soften statements while conveying clear meaning.
Put simply, countries try to sound respectful and careful when speaking to both their citizens and the world. Words like attentive, committed, restraint, and engagement are advanced vocabulary for formal English. Long sentences with clauses linked by while, because, or in order to provide a natural rhythm for English learners and demonstrate how to express serious ideas politely, which is especially useful when discussing sensitive political or international topics.
It is also worth noting that diplomatic responses often balance firmness with politeness. Leaders may express concern or disappointment without issuing threats, because such an approach maintains credibility, encourages dialogue, and avoids unnecessary escalation. For example, a statement might read, "We express concern over recent developments and urge all parties to engage constructively," which communicates awareness and a call for positive behavior without aggression. Understanding this balance helps learners recognize the subtleties of formal English used in international affairs and highlights the careful choice of words in professional communication.
For learners, this shows that polite political English often avoids direct confrontation. Words like constructively, engage, and recent developments are formal, and connecting phrases like and, while, and without are used to combine multiple ideas in long sentences. Practicing these structures improves listening comprehension, teaches sentence rhythm, and helps learners produce formal English suitable for discussions about diplomacy or professional contexts.
Finally, observing global reactions allows learners to see how countries manage sensitive topics responsibly and maintain international stability. Official responses, whether highlighting dialogue, urging restraint, or calling for calm, demonstrate that political communication is deliberate, strategic, and designed to achieve understanding without conflict. By analyzing these responses carefully, learners gain insight into formal English, polite phrasing, and professional vocabulary, while also developing critical listening skills that can be applied to news, academic reports, and global discussions.
In conclusion, learners should pay attention to reporting verbs, polite expressions, and long sentence structures used in diplomatic English. Words like urge, express, emphasize, and encourage, combined with connectors like because, while, and in order to, create the rhythm and clarity necessary to understand complex international communications. By practicing these patterns, learners improve comprehension, develop confidence in listening to formal English, and learn how subtle phrasing conveys seriousness, respect, and careful negotiation in global affairs.
As we reach the conclusion of today's discussion, it is valuable to reflect on both the global concepts we have explored and the English skills you have practiced, because understanding international relations requires patience, attention to detail, and careful listening, and at the same time, learning English in the context of real-world topics allows you to connect vocabulary, sentence patterns, and formal expressions to meaningful situations. Throughout this podcast, we have examined how statements by political leaders, protests in other countries, media framing, pressure tactics, and diplomatic responses operate within the complex framework of international law, sovereignty, and power politics. Each of these topics has presented an opportunity for learners to encounter long sentences, formal vocabulary, and logical connectors, which are all essential for advanced comprehension in English. By listening attentively, noticing how ideas are linked, and analyzing the choice of words and sentence structure, you have been practicing skills that go beyond simple vocabulary memorization, because long-form listening builds endurance, comprehension, and the ability to process nuanced, detailed information in English, which is exactly the type of skill that professional readers, academics, and journalists use every day when engaging with complex content.
In simpler English, Adam is reminding us that today was not only about learning international events, but also about improving your English. You have practiced listening to long sentences, understanding new words, and following ideas that are connected logically, which is excellent training for both comprehension and fluency. Vocabulary like sovereignty, diplomatic, pressure tactics, constructively, emphasize, and engagement appeared repeatedly, and noticing how they fit naturally into long sentences helps learners remember meaning and usage. Additionally, phrases such as call for restraint, express concern, and encourage dialogue have shown how formal and polite English is used to communicate serious ideas without offending anyone. By focusing on how sentences are structured, learners can develop better rhythm in listening, gain confidence in following extended explanations, and practice understanding context in a calm, patient way, which strengthens both comprehension and the ability to think critically in English.
Reflecting on global politics and language together also helps learners understand how communication is used to influence, inform, and persuade without conflict. In today's episode, we have seen how political leaders use statements carefully to maintain influence, signal intentions, and respect sovereignty, while countries respond through measured diplomatic language that avoids escalation. Each section highlighted both content knowledge and language strategies, from understanding power politics and economic pressure to analyzing media framing and formal reporting verbs. For learners, observing these strategies in real examples provides a model for how English is used in professional, academic, and media contexts, because long-form explanations often contain multiple clauses, precise connectors, and formal vocabulary that allows speakers to convey detailed reasoning, subtle distinctions, and careful nuance, which is exactly what advanced learners need to develop listening endurance, comprehension confidence, and the ability to follow complex ideas without losing track of the main point.
For learners, this reflection also emphasizes that improving English is a gradual process. And listening to extended podcasts like this helps develop patience and consistency. Each paragraph, sentence, and connector provides repeated exposure to formal English patterns, which strengthens understanding over time. Notice phrases like "in other words," which means that, as a result, and because of this, which help link multiple ideas and provide clarity in long discussions. Vocabulary repetition in meaningful context, rather than isolated word lists, is particularly effective for memory and comprehension. And learners who take notes, practice pronunciation, or even pause to reflect will benefit more from each listening session. Developing confidence in long-form listening is not about speed, but about understanding rhythm, sentence structure, and the logic behind complex explanations, all of which have been modeled in today's episode.
Another key takeaway is the importance of distinguishing fact, opinion, and framing in both global affairs and language learning. By analyzing statements, diplomatic responses, and media reporting, learners can see how words are chosen to influence perception, maintain neutrality, and communicate respect. For example, verbs like emphasize, urge, express, and encourage convey subtle meaning that differs from stronger verbs like demand or threaten, and understanding these nuances allows learners to interpret meaning accurately. Similarly, connectors like although, because, which allows and while help organize ideas in long sentences, and repeated practice with these structures improves reading comprehension, listening stamina, and the ability to follow multi-layered arguments, all of which are essential for anyone who wants to develop advanced English skills while engaging with serious real-world topics.
From a language perspective, learners should reflect on how formal English often uses multiple clauses and logical connectors to express complex ideas clearly and politely. Vocabulary related to diplomacy, law, and international relations, such as sovereignty, negotiation, constructively, legitimacy, and frameworks, appeared throughout the episode, and recognizing their usage in context is far more effective than memorizing definitions. Listening to long sentences repeatedly helps learners internalize rhythm, understand how ideas connect, and notice subtle differences in meaning. Moreover, formal English often includes indirect expressions, polite verbs, and modal constructions like should, may, or might, which allow speakers to communicate carefully and avoid offense, a skill that is crucial not only for international topics but also for professional and academic communication.
It is also important to consider that combining global awareness with language learning enhances both knowledge and comprehension simultaneously. By engaging with serious topics such as protests, pressure tactics, international law, and diplomatic responses, learners experience English in a real, meaningful context, rather than in artificial examples. This approach helps you understand how sentences are structured in professional discussions, how tone and word choice affect meaning, and how ideas are developed logically over extended passages. Listening attentively to long sections like these develops focus, comprehension endurance, and confidence, enabling learners to follow complex explanations in both spoken and written English while appreciating the relevance of content to real-world global affairs.
Finally, learners should remember that improvement comes with patience, practice, and consistency. Long-form listening exercises, such as today's episode, provide repeated exposure to formal vocabulary, sentence connectors, and structured arguments, which strengthens comprehension over time. Writing down key words, practicing pronunciation, and summarizing ideas in your own words are all excellent strategies for reinforcing learning. Phrases like in conclusion, key takeaway, this shows that, and as a result, can also help learners summarize ideas clearly when speaking or writing, and observing these patterns in context allows learners to internalize professional English usage for both academic and practical purposes.
In conclusion, today's episode has combined language learning with global understanding, showing how political concepts, diplomatic responses, media framing, and international law intersect with formal English usage. Learners have practiced recognizing long sentences, formal verbs, logical connectors, polite expressions, and abstract vocabulary, all while following a structured discussion on a real-world topic. By continuing to listen to educational content of this type, learners build not only comprehension endurance and listening confidence, but also critical thinking skills, analytical ability, and a deeper understanding of how English functions in professional, academic, and international contexts.
To summarize for learners, focus on vocabulary, sentence rhythm, connectors, and polite phrasing, because these elements are used extensively in professional and academic English. Practicing with long passages develops stamina, attention to detail, and confidence in understanding complex ideas. Remember that learning English through serious topics is not only about improving grammar or vocabulary, but also about training your mind to process information critically, make connections, and communicate clearly. Patience, consistency, and reflection are essential, and by following these practices, learners can achieve both language growth and a better understanding of the world around them.